moderator, broadcasting live from South Lake Tahoe, California, the reading capital of the world. We are on a mission to make reading fun and achievable for all. Each week we read no more than 99 pages of a book, and we'll live stream a discussion with awesome panelists and Q&A right here. Even if you can't squeeze in the reading, that's okay. You've got 99 problems, reading ain't one. If you enjoy the conversation, please subscribe below. Every vote of support counts. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn at 99 Pages Club. We also launched the audio as a podcast, which you can download on Apple Podcasts. Just search for 99 Pages. So this is our final panel discussing Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. You know, Caste has been a journey through some dark and unsavory foundations of American supremacy. I came into this book personally believing that there was systemic bias and racism, but not fully understanding the horror that Black Americans have gone through in the New World since they came over 500 years ago. And what's scary is, and I swear to God, I'm not bragging here, but like I would classify myself as a highly educated and fairly well-read person. So for me to be totally blown away by documented historical atrocities committed at the hands of a country that I love, that I've served, and that I've studied closely, it makes me beg the question, like, how do we go through these the halls of elite institutions? I myself went through West Point, Columbia, Wharton, Microsoft, VMware, the US Army, institutions of American excellence, and had no clue what was going on, where all these foundational pillars of excellence came from, whether it was sharecropping, lynching, redlining. This was both a heartbreaking book for me, but also an inspiring book for me, because I feel like even though this was not our generation's fault, it is our generation's responsibility. And that's what I think we're here today to discuss, is the call to action after reading this book. So very excited. But just before we get started, a couple admin notes. So last week we introduced our anonymous suggestion box. These are tough topics and not everyone feels comfortable asking some of these questions publicly. So if you have questions regarding race and caste, go to safe.99pagesclub.com. Safe as in safe space. You can submit a question or comment anonymously and we'll take a look at it. Next week, we're going to be back here with an interview with Mr. Gautam Mukunda. He's a Harvard Business School and Kennedy School of Government professor. He's the author of the book Indispensable, a quintessential book on leadership, both in government and corporate America. That's next week, September 27th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific, right here. Now, lastly, on October 4th, Sunday, we're going to be kicking off our next book with this book club. We're going to be reading, due to election season, we're going to be reading Ezra Klein, Why We're Polarized. You know, I just felt that, like, with election season coming around, we wanted to be very thoughtful about the values of not only this book club, but like the change that we want to see in the world. And that's going to happen when we actually take a step back and really have civil discourse with each other as a country. So now I'm going to go ahead and pull in our panelists. I want to first introduce Mr. Michael Ibecky. So Michael is a smart city technologist living in Seoul, South Korea, an amazing story from Nigeria, grew up in Indiana, Stanford Business School on the way, and actually an incredible reader. He's one of the only people that I think reads more books in a week than I do. So really glad to have Michael on. Obviously, Stesha Doku, just one of my favorite people on the panel, Duke, Stanford, Harvard trained anesthesiologist, a healthcare design expert, currently living in Greensboro, North Carolina. Very glad to have you back, Stesha. Thank you so much for playing such a quintessential role in this panel. Obviously, Jackie Bello, a former Baltimore public school teacher, now an ed tech innovator. So Jackie is launching on October 7th, right, Jackie?
Correct.
It's October 7th, and she is launching our 99 Pages EDU book club. It is a book club for educators. It's Wednesdays, and we just realized that the educator community right now is in a world of stress, and we want to make sure that you feel heard, connected all around. And in that same vein, I am really excited to introduce Mrs. Cynthia Abbott. So Cynthia Abbott is a talent acquisition consultant and entrepreneur. She's lived in Dallas, Atlanta, and she actually hails from my hometown of Roanoke, Virginia, which is, so she holds a special place in my heart. Now, on Thursday next week, she is launching the 99 Pages Hustle Book Club for both the underemployed and the unemployed. Look, we heard from our audience that like during these tough times, one of the biggest obstacles to reading is actually, you know, if you're going through some really hard times, like, and you can't read because you're worried about jobs, you're worried about kids, you're worried about all the stresses in life, we wanted to create a special venue for you to kind of just take a moment and develop the skills it's going to take to get back in the job market, get your career wherever you need it to be going. And I could not think of a better person to help you on that journey than Cynthia. So Michael, Jackie, Stesha, Cynthia, thank you all for coming in and having this conversation with us. So first, Cynthia, I'd love to start with you. Yes. So listen, part 6 of this book talks about the contemporary symptoms of caste, particularly in political discourse. And, you know, one thing I love about your bio is you lived all over the South. And one thing I want to point out in particular is you were in Atlanta when Obama was elected. And in many ways, you know, Atlanta is ground zero for some of these harsh caste tensions that are discussed in this book. You know, it's where, and it's just a city that I think plays an important role. So what I'd like to ask you is, especially because Wilkerson cites this uncomfortable conversation she heard in a first-class cabin of an airplane where 2 older white men were quite thrilled about President Trump's election and as a return to dignity, and quite dismayed at 8 years of Obama. And I'm just curious, when you were living in Atlanta as a white woman, you know, did you identify this level of animosity that Wilkerson is citing against Obama that was beyond political? Was it in fact racial?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that a majority of conservative America, especially in Atlanta, did a great job of making Barack Obama out to be this African-American liberal that was going to come into your home in the middle of the night and, you know, snatch your children and erase Christianity. And they did a great job of continuing that narrative even after he was elected and then reelected. And there was this fear, this sense of, oh my God, now do we all have to be equal? Now that this African-American man has been elected president? I know from my personal setting, I was very excited to see that happen and very excited to see what I believe is the country moving forward. And then on the reverse of that, Rajiv, living in Dallas when Donald Trump was elected, there were actually organizations that set out to see if they could underpay individuals because they thought there would now be a move to less equality based on the fact that Donald Trump was president. And they were quite happy with that.
That's absolutely incredible to me. You know, I thank you for being honest and sharing that with us, because it's something that I think a lot of people don't really have perspective on. Michael, I'd love to turn it to you. I mean, you grew up in Nigeria and then Indiana, in America's heartland. It's part of the country where, you know, we know has some struggles with racial and caste tensions. So I'm curious, you know, growing up in the Midwest, you know, could you tell us a little bit about what you saw and what you felt from a perspective of caste, having read the book?
Sure. So I grew up in the middle of Indiana, and I went to Indiana University, which is basically 20 minutes from Martinsville. I think one of the founding headquarters for the KKK at the time. But then, you know, 30 minutes away is a liberal university like Indiana University with like the second per capita ratio of gay population. So that kind of like having that different views in the same place is interesting. Now, as a Black man, I can tell you this. As a Nigerian, I think my point of view of race and caste was different because I necessarily came to America with a point of view. And I also came to America with a goal in mind, right? I had my origins, I had my values preset, and I wasn't necessarily relying on America to imbue that in me. However, when I did look at my African-American colleagues, and I could see the struggle because a lot of like their own history and their own sense of direction, I thought were not necessarily clear to them. Some of the things that made sense to me at my household, for them, they were still trying to figure out. And it was only much later that I got a chance to understand this a little better, because when people then started to categorize me as an African and also started to treat me the same way, that's when I started to understand the pain of this institutional racism. I'll give you a very simple story. The drive from Bloomington, Indiana to Indianapolis is about an hour and 10 minutes sometimes. And within that drive, I'll probably get pulled over at least 2 to 3 times. by different white police officers. And generally speaking, they're only stopping just to have a reason to search, to, see your vehicle, see who's driving, and make sure that you don't have anything happening to you. And this wasn't apparent to me until one day I was actually going to the same direction with my white colleague, my white friend in school. And maybe it was just a coincidence, but in reality, like we drove past the same route and still had hit the same spots where you found these cops that would sit there, and there was nothing, And I made a mental note of that, and I realized, like, this is representative of the experience that we see, but it never gets talked about until a more recent exposure by folks with like smartphones, sharing the experiences now in the media.
Incredible, Michael. I want to, like, it just, what really kind of scares me, honestly, and like I said in my intro, like, I didn't know, like, I feel ashamed almost that I didn't know all of these things. And you're right, like that appearance of a smartphone, that only happened really in the late 2000, like 2007, I think, is when this Apple iPhone was introduced. And just imagine the decades before that, when we didn't have the smartphones, like how many incidences like that happened. And it's kind of tragic, and it pulls at my strings. And Michael, I want to double click on something though. When we first met, you mentioned at something that really surprised me was that you felt a degree of imposter syndrome. And like, you're one of the more accomplished people I've met, right? I mean, Stanford Business School, working for home run companies. You even got, you're even living abroad, working on smart cities. Like, these are really hard problems that you're being asked to solve. And yet, if someone like you feels imposter syndrome, like, I got to ask, to what extent do you think that stems from your identities as either a Black man, maybe an immigrant, or just generally a member of a subjugated class? Can you talk to us a little bit about what imposter syndrome is, what it's like, and how it affects your decision as a professional, and maybe even as a member of society?
Sure. So imposter syndrome, it's basically the feeling that someday somebody's going to find out that you're not as good as you are, right? As you claim to be. Someday somebody's just going to open the door and catch you like, oh, wow, he really is a fraud. And it's not just minorities that face this. Also, women face this. Also, immigrants also face this. And also I have a lot of like white friends also that face this. And so I don't think it's necessarily a racial or cultural thing. I think it's just generally something we feel as we elevate ourselves from one level of life to another, and where we realize that what we're now doing doesn't necessarily jive with our own conception of our own a personal identity, until later our self-concept of our identity catches up with the reality that imposter syndrome kind of goes away. But I will say this, that it does feel a lot harder when you come into an environment where you are the only minority, or the only woman, or the only person from a particular area, and everybody else looks a certain way, and you ask yourself, wait, did I deserve to be here, or was I a lucky draw, or was I a mistake? And sometimes it takes having to see other people like you, hear their stories and journeys, for you to realize everybody's kind of going through the same thing. And I think the main discussion about why we do need more diversity, why we do need more equality, is because we want to bring more of those voices to the table. Because when we do, we're going to realize that when you put the race issue aside, we see that we actually do have a lot more commonalities, because we face the same fears, we face the same struggles, we face the same issues in our households, in our own personal lives, in our own psyches. And if we can spend more time in that, empathizing with each other, then we don't have room for this divisive conversations we have in the world.
Beautifully said, Michael, honestly. And I think it was I can't remember I can't remember where I heard it, but it was like to some of the extent, like, you got to be able to see yourself in the world, right? And have those role models that you can look to. And yeah, and I think Jackie actually last broadcast said something that really gave me something to think about. I think we were answering a question about meritocracy in the world of affirmative action. And she, astutely pointed out that even the concept of meritocracy in itself can be rooted in biased metrics, right? Like, for example, I think even Ibram Kendi talks about it in How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's like, if you take the SATs and you do well, like, well, okay, great, but that might be a reflection of your ability to pay a couple $1,000 for an SAT prep course, for example, right? Like, it's not necessarily indicative of your true academic or professional potential, which is exceptionally hard to quantify and define as quote unquote a meritocracy. Stesha, I'd love to turn it to you. Have you ever, does any of this imposter syndrome, resonate with you? And I'm curious if it is rooted in your identity as a Black woman.
Sure. And I definitely was nodding my head as Michael was talking, because many of the experiences that he has mentioned are things that I can relate to. And, as a little secret, just in case you guys know, basically all physicians at a baseline have imposter syndrome. Like, it is a constant for us. And part of that is just that the depth of medical knowledge makes it so difficult to feel like you have a grasp on it. And you don't really go through medical training realizing until you're sort of further along that you aren't going to grasp every single concept. You're not going to know everything that there is in medicine. So at a baseline, that's sort of where we all start. And medical education doesn't do a good job of showing you that there can be uncertainty. But I think on top of that, like Michael was saying, there are very few Black physicians in this country. And that makes it so much harder to see yourself in the people that you're working with, or to see yourself in even the patient population that you may be working with. And so for me, the imposter syndrome starts at the level of, okay, I'm a physician trying to learn as much as I possibly can, and I don't know everything. You look at COVID right now, we don't know everything. We're still trying to figure it out. But on top of that, I get challenged sometimes because of my race and my gender, particularly that combo of being a Black woman. And in the levels of caste, we would say probably the dominant caste being at the very highest, we have white men, and probably at the very lowest in this book, based off of the example she gives, would probably be Black women. So for me, in addition to trying to be a physician, I'm trying to prove myself every time I walk into a patient's room that I am qualified to be able to take care of them. And I'll tell you, like, I get asked every single day, where I went to school. And I know that my white male colleagues are not being asked that same question. And the question, I think, is being asked because they're trying to find out whether or not I have the qualifications that I say I have. And that, if you ask it enough times, will certainly sow imposter syndrome. It makes me question whether or not I am supposed to be where I'm supposed to be. And it makes me question whether or not I am deserving. And I think that for some people, when they don't see enough physicians of a different race, of a different gender, they don't understand that those people can be just as good. They don't understand that those people can be just as caring. They don't understand all the ways in which sometimes diversity can be to your benefit in taking care of different patients along the line. And so, yes, I definitely have related to the things that, all of you have mentioned in terms of imposter syndrome. And I think that it makes it so much harder when you're a minority in spaces where there are very few. I think there's maybe 3% of physicians in this country are Black women. 5% are Black people in general. So we're not very well represented. And I think sometimes people question whether or not we should be there.
Stesha, while you were talking, we had an anonymous question come in for you, if you don't mind. The question is, I don't really understand why imposter syndrome would be rooted in gender or race, because at the end of the day, a highly regulated and regimented profession like the medical one, you should be able to look at any established physician and see yourself in them. What keeps you from looking at a male white doctor and seeing yourself in them? And I think that's interesting, yeah, because I see what they're saying. What they're trying to say is, like, especially in these highly regimented professions, like race and gender, at least on the surface, don't appear to be like quintessential components of it. And the norms and the professionalism of the medical industry would be more defining. So was it hard for you to see yourself in, say, a white male doctor that you respected and admired and wanted to aspire to be like him?
Well, I think that at the times that I didn't feel like I would see myself was particularly when looking for mentorship. And that becomes a whole nother level on which, meritocracy can really be a failure. When you're looking for people to help you advance, sometimes people tend to, not always, but they tend to look for people that they see as a mentor, that they see that can be like themselves, or that they really feel that they can give something to. And a lot of times people will choose that based off of, gender, for example. Females love to mentor other females because there's not a whole lot of us in particular fields. There may not be a lot of us at, the highest levels. And so in sort of the gender example, there's a opportunity to elevate someone who may not always be looked at if you are in a position of power. And I think similarly, when you look at race, places, or at least studies that I have heard about, have demonstrated that where there are already Black people, Black females at the top, there tends to be a lot more other people who are coming behind them, who are being mentored, who are being looked at in order to, bring them up to the same levels or to give them the same resources. And I think that it's sort of that looking to belong that we all sort of reach out for. And if you are, someone who is looking to find someone like yourself to mentor, if there's not a whole lot of you, it makes it so much harder for those people to exist in order to provide that sort of level of mentorship. So I don't think that I could not see myself in a white male, but I think that the challenges that a white male may face are very different than the challenges that I may face. And so having a Black female who could mentor me would make it so much more engaging for me to be able to ask some pointed questions about how to navigate things that a white male would never have to navigate in the medical field.
Rajiv, if I can jump in for half a second.
Of course, please.
There's a very important point I want to highlight, because it's not just about medical field. When Barack Obama became president, for the first time, I think a lot of young Black men can now see a role model that is not a rapper, musician, or athlete. Now, you say, well, that's not possible. Why can't these Black kids see themselves in all the other white presidents we've had? Why is that the case? Because to some degree, we need to believe when we see somebody that looks like us that could be me someday. There is no way that I can look at a white man and say that could be me, because I can never change my color, right? But it's nice it's important to see somebody that looks like you, to allow you to build a future concept of yourself that it is possible. So I think that question is important, and I'm glad the person asked this question. But I think the deeper issue here isn't so much of the institution itself, but it comes down to the human, the people within this institution that you can relate with. You can have a relationship that you can talk to, you can go to, and they can talk to you and understand where you're coming from, and feel what you've experienced, and say, I know what you've been through. I've seen what you've seen, and I know what you're going through right now. And so when I say something to you, you will listen, because guess what? You and I are kindred spirit. That, I think, is fundamental to what Stesha is saying.
Brilliantly said, Michael. I think what both Stesha and Michael, I think what you've made, what I'm hearing is, what there's a difference between the letter of a profession, like the letter of a law, the letter of policy, and its implementation and its execution. Because even though the medical profession, for example, in your case, Stesha, might be very regimented and uniform, and there's certain standards that apply to everyone, that's great. But in execution, it's still human beings, right? There's, bias can still exist and create these differences, regardless of what the letter of the policy might be. And I think the point about mentorship in particular is really valuable. I actually would love to call out, if you guys don't mind, some of the live chat comments, because we're getting some great ones. Lisa Borsarge, wonderful comment. My profession is majority women, and she is a librarian. They are quick to put you, if you, my mistake. My profession is majority women, but if you step into, as a librarian, if you step into information science, they're quick to put you back in your lane. You feel like a fake in your own field. Oh my gosh, that's so tragic. Julie Drury, an educator in Roanoke, Virginia. As one of the few females, as a graduate student in math 30 years ago, I felt that I had to prove myself in that department. Judy Bello reminds me of RBG. What an amazing call out, who was turned down by the marquee law firms after graduating with such distinction from Columbia Law School because she was a woman, a Jew, and a mother. Absolutely incredible. So thank you all, ladies, for putting those wonderful anecdotes out there. Jackie, I would really love to go to you here, because as an educator, like, can you talk to us about like how early does this imposter syndrome manifest itself in a subjugated class? I'm sure teaching in Baltimore, you must have seen this manifest itself in some way, shape, or form. What does that look like in your point of view?
Sure. Well, first, I'm going to say that our urban public schools are so segregated that actually the Black students that I taught in Baltimore were in the majority at school and in their neighborhoods. And there was a section of the book, section 5, so what we discussed last week, that talked about the adverse health effects of being Black or being in a subjugated caste. And I believe Wilkerson talked about, quote, poor Mexican immigrants ended up having less adverse health effects because they were so isolated from the mainstream that they were kind of insulated from discrimination. But reading that actually made me so sad, because that means that essentially that reinforces the caste mantra. Like, let's keep them separate. Let's keep them subservient. Don't try to upend the hierarchy. Where I see imposter syndrome is when my students try to break free of the low income neighborhoods that they come from. They get into elite colleges when they try to change lanes and press against those barriers of caste. And what we can do about it, I think I've heard it a lot on this call. Rajiv, you mentioned that this book surprised you. Well, first of all, put books like this in the curriculum. The US education system really fails to, it struggles to discuss Black contributions to American literature, to American history in accurate and identity-affirming ways. We also need more Black teachers, more Black professors. I went to Princeton University. We had 9 departments focused on European languages and culture, and only 1 small program in African studies. Like, that's caste.
That's actually a hilarious call out. Cynthia, I have a question here for you, because I think this segue is it's actually what you brought out, Jackie, is actually a really logical segue to this, which is, Cynthia, you and I grew up in the same hometown of Roanoke, Virginia. We grew up about an hour away from Robert E. Lee's hometown, birthplace, where he's buried, etc. And, Wilkerson in the book references a great deal about Robert E. Lee and how, as the general that led the Confederacy, he still has thousands of namesakes all over the country, well beyond Lexington, Virginia, right? I mean, he's got counties, he's got statues everywhere. Even at West Point, where I went to school, yes, he was the former superintendent of West Point, but he's got barracks, he's got gates. We have a huge infrastructure named for Robert E. Lee. And do you remember this? Like, because I was obviously a minority kid, and I felt a little discomfort there. But I'm curious, from your perspective, growing up down the road from Robert E. Lee's burial place, like, do you remember the degree to which he was present in your education system? What was conveyed?
Absolutely. I mean, it was definitely, I think, a sense of hero worship, if it were, that Robert E. Lee could do no wrong. And if you reflect back on the way you were taught the Civil War in Virginia, especially in a school system in, Southwest Virginia, it was really that Lee was this great guy, and that he, really disagreed with slavery, and how he had this big mantle he had to carry because Virginia decided to side with the Confederate States, right? That it was all going to fall wherever Virginia went. And really, it wasn't until I got out of that really high level public education, if it were, and started doing my own research, he was a devout slave owner. He shouldn't be hero worshiped. But I think part of that, Rajiv, comes back to the central core that in the South, we have struggled, and Stesha, you can probably speak to this as well. We have struggled with the new identity that the side of history we were on was profoundly wrong. And we needed to let go of that mindset, of that mantra. We've let it leak into our education system. We've let it leak into our schools. You know, you go through Roanoke and you've got, you know, Jackson High, right? Named after Stonewall Jackson. And you drive through Richmond, right? A few hours from Roanoke, and there's a huge monument of Robert E. Lee on Traveler on Monument Avenue, right? So you're coming into one of these supposed most diverse cities in Virginia, and there's Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederacy. And I think that that kind of over exposure to him really set the narrative for me early on, that I didn't realize how deep racism and how deep caste ran, because it's kind of this overlay of how great he was.
Wow. Yeah. You know, and that's so fascinating. I mean, if correct me if I'm wrong, Cynthia, if you don't mind me asking a follow up, you did a lot of research on Robert E. Lee at one point in your education, did you not?
I did.
Yeah.
I took a specialized class at Virginia Tech that was taught by an emeritus professor that was responsible for maintaining Lee's grave. You know, especially like for students at VMI, it's considered a high honor for a cadet to be responsible for taking care of his tomb. And when you go visit his monument, it's almost like going into a church. There's usually someone playing very light piano music. You're encouraged to bring money if you want to make a donation to the foundation that cares for his tomb. You know, if you go to New York, you can walk past Grant's tomb and it's not a big parade, but Virginia really held on to this.
You know, what's coming to my mind right now is like when I was at West Point, you know, Sherman Barracks actually faces Lee Barracks. And I don't know, there's a sense of like, even though we named these institutions, statues, barracks, buildings, gates, etc., after Confederate generals, it was almost in the spirit of, at the time, reunification, right? And you know, General Lee was the superintendent of West Point at one time, and I think I grew up actually having a lot of respect for General Lee, even though I may have disagreed with some of his ideology, and quite frankly, he may have viewed me as a subjugated caste member myself if he ever met me.
And me as well as a woman, right? There were no women serving in the Confederate Army. What was that?
Indeed. But I mean, this kind of brings up a question, actually, Michael, that I had for you about cancel culture, right? Like one thing we're facing is this idea that like, hey, if history is not flattering and we don't like Robert E. Lee because he led the South and that was slavery, like we can just take down his statue and we can boycott celebrities when we don't like what they say. We can boycott companies when we don't like whatever policy they put in place. But like at some point, don't we have to like, you know, these are moments in our history. I mean, in your opinion, do these statues of Confederate leaders, like, do they actually have a tangible effect on your day-to-day life as a man? Like, why do we have to cancel our culture and cancel our history, if you will, to move forward?
Well, I think the first question we should ask is whose culture and whose history is it? Right? I think that's where we have to start the conversation. Black people were not considered human when they were brought to this country. And over the course of 300-400 years, they fought to just normalize the idea that they're also human beings. And they have contributed to just as much to the creation of this wealth of the country, right? And so if we are going to glorify the slave owners, I think in the same regard, we should also glorify those that fought against that, those that fought for freedom and equality. I don't agree that we should erase the history of America, but I do think that we should re-examine it and say, who should we still keep in today's world? Who still represents the future we want to build of this country, this experiment we're running? And who should we add? Because there's a list of very memorable, capable people that are representative of the equality that we're trying to, in the equal society that we're trying to create today, that should be commemorated. So as a Black man, I think that it is important to be, just as much as I can see Robert E. Lee statues, I also want to be able to see statues of other, representative people that have made significant impact, men, women, and other people. So I don't believe in the cancel culture, but I do believe that for me, it's indicative of a need for us to re-examine the past, re-examine our history, and ask ourselves the same question. Knowing what we know now, would we keep them? And I think that's the question that needs to be asked.
Talk about something we're going to put on a marquee billboard somewhere. You know, it's like, whose culture are we canceling, right? Like that's, you know, and I got to admit, Michael, like, especially someone like, you know, like I was talking with Cynthia, right? Like I told Cynthia, like we grew up in Roanoke, we grew up in, and then went to the academy. Like, you know, guys like Lee are just revered, and it's really hard because it does feel a little bit like my culture, right? It does feel a little bit like my heritage, and I find that so crazy because, like, at the same time, I consider you a part of my culture. I consider Stesha one of my best friends in the world. Like, it's like this. It just does not compute. I love the way you said that. Stesha, I would love to turn the question over to you and ask you the same if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, Michael just said it so beautifully that we really need to be re-examining at the end of the day. And I think that one of the things, you know, like I live in North Carolina, so there's several ways in which the Confederacy sort of shows itself still to this day. And I think that moving forward, like Michael says, we have to find a way to start representing and honoring the people who are doing things now that are going to really add to our future, or who have done things recently that are adding to our future and our current state of the United States. I think that in particular, I don't understand quite fully what the, I guess, passion is about the Confederate statues in particular. And I think when you read Caste, you know, she sort of makes an argument that it's about sort of preserving the caste, being symbols of preserving caste systems and the hierarchy. But the passion sometimes that I hear about people, you know, staying up overnight to guard these statues makes me just wonder, to what extent are people willing to go to sort of keep a history that we should really be ashamed of? And it makes me question how it is that we're going to make that next step when there's so many people who do want to keep, like we have mentioned, it's okay to keep talking about the history, but there's a level of keeping the history and discussing it, and there's a level of glorifying it. And the statues, I think, are on that level of glorifying it that seems above what you would expect if we're trying to move forward.
Super.
If I could jump in here
Absolutely,
for a moment, you know, if you think back to when we were in high school, it was not uncommon to see someone wearing a hat that had, you know, stars and bars, the Confederate flag on it, right? It was very kind of subconsciously indoctrinated into our culture. And that even if you weren't, let's say, a Confederate sympathizer, right, it was still around in such commonplace. I've had the good fortune of traveling to some other countries. And one thing I've been fascinated with is that in Germany, they took it as a call to action, that they recognize the history of what happened. They house a lot of these monuments and statues in museums and use it as an educational tool for people who visit, for their young people, so it's never repeated. We never made the pivot in the South to say, this isn't who we want to be anymore. We will acknowledge what happened so it does not happen again, because you continuously have this subtle reoccurrence, or not so subtle, based on events that have happened. You know, we never really turned that knob into the different direction.
Extremely well said.
Hey, Rajiva, can I just
absolutely jump on in, guys? No, don't ask for permission. Just go for it.
So, Cynthia, there's something you said, which is, who do we want to be?
Mm-hmm.
I think this is fundamental to what we are talking about, because today, as America, there's just so many we's, and so depending on who you ask, they will make a case for or against what you just said. Mm-hmm. So I really think that we need to come back to the base level of humanity, not white, black, this color or that color. Let's just get back to the basics and say we are first and foremost human beings. Let's start that conversation there and say, as human beings of the United States of America, who do we want to be? That's, for me, the most important thing.
Agreed.
I think, yeah, absolutely. Who do we want to be? That's, and you know what's really difficult about that, you know, Cynthia, I think one of the words that just kind of jumped out at me was the word shame. And, you know, for many of these folks who were asking to, you know, strip down statues of Robert E. Lee, rename Jackson, like, these are not just, I mean, that's somebody's grandfather, right? And the soldiers that served under these officers were, you know, somebody's grandfather's great-grandfather's heritage, right? That runs deep. And it's so psychologically torturous to be able to have to call your own family in that limelight. And I think that's part of the struggle here, is that we're asking a certain slice of America to honestly bring shame upon their own families. And it's a very difficult thing to ask part of the country to do. I gotta admit, as much empathy as I have for, you know, the plight of African Americans in this book, you know, as I think about some of these like things that we got to do to fix the problem, I have a lot of empathy for, you know, the families of those poor white people in the South that are gonna, you know, that'll ultimately have to pay the price in order for us to fix this problem.
Well, and if you think about
yeah,
it,
please.
in a different paradigm as to why they were poor, right? So if you look at it from a, let's say, a Southern Confederate perspective, the Confederacy was wealthy, right? And part of that wealth required slavery to generate that level of economic prosperity, right? The Confederacy loses, and you had people that literally had $1 million plantations that were now worth nothing. Cotton was no longer the number one export, right? So the South has to rebuild with what? With what identity? And when people and groups of people don't have a new identity, they'll hang on to the past, right? When your future looks unknown and uncertain, you want to conserve, and you will reference back to a time when life was really good for you. You know, if you believe your better days are ahead of you, even though you're struggling, you'll still keep going. If you talk to any really diehard conservative, they're going to reference a time in the past when it was great, even if they're not a, you know, Confederate flag flying individual, which not all conservatives are, but they're going to go back to a time when life was great. And I think that's what really hindered the Southern states from really pushing through that and moving forward, is because there was this desire to hang on to what was identified as this kind of utopia that was stolen from them.
Rajiv, I just want to add to that, because I think Cynthia brings up a really good point. Because when I was reading this book and the title Caste, the Origins of Our Discontent, I remember thinking that this was going to be about African Americans or Black people in this country and identifying why it is that we have the plight that we have. And I realized that as I was reading this book, that it's about also the origins of the discontent of the people Cynthia was talking about. Poor white people in the South, or people who feel like they should be benefiting from a dominant caste status, but who are not. You know, it goes back to the question that we talked about last week about what does it mean to be, you know, have white privilege if you don't feel like you're having any privileges. And that dynamic is, I think, essential to understanding how it is that we can move forward, because we don't only have to talk about or think about individuals who are being put in the lower caste in terms of their race or their gender, but we also have to think about those people who we say are in the dominant caste, but who don't feel like they are, and who are perhaps adding to the fact that these groups in the lower caste are continuing to stay at a lower level because they're not willing to, you know, fight for the rights that they would also benefit from if the lower caste was to be brought up. They're not willing necessarily to vote in the ways that would give benefits to everyone across the board. And so I think that the origins of their discontent would, thinking about that at least, would give us a way of understanding people on both sides of that issue, and not just, you know, minorities or Black people or the lowest caste, but people who might be across all the castes.
I think this transitions us nicely to chapter 7 of the book, which is all about the awakening needed. How do we unpack these, our own histories? Related, I used to have a nickname, Stonewall Jackson, growing up in Virginia, that I was so proud of because I played soccer. I was the last line of defense. I let nobody buy me. And it's only at age 34, reading this book, that I've revisited that memory and seen it in a completely new light. That is the awakening needed, just to unpack the narratives. That's what is going to help us see these, you know, invisible tentacles of caste that's like a chokehold right now in society.
And I want to add something else as well, that beneath all of this is the economic concern, right? As a Black man, I can tell you right now that I probably have a lot more in common with the upper class of America than I do with the lower class. And that's devoid of my actual race. And so when we gonna try to solve this problem, we really need to look at the systemic issues that is causing poverty across all castes, not just Black, white, on all the different groups in America. Because if we don't get to the root cause of this fear, I'm sorry, we're only just doing lip service to all this conversation, right? You can come in, we can come here and talk about how to advance this conversation, but we also need to recognize that the people in office need to think about how do we expand that prosperity, not just for the people at the top, but for the lower classes as well. And how do we get people re-educated, right, to be able to be employable? How do we give mankind, human beings, no matter what your race is, the ability to go earn an income and raise a family? Why do quote unquote 1960s and the past seem to be something to want? Why? Because that was the prosperity of America. That was when America was growing. You had 2-income household and people could buy a house and live a very comfortable life, right? That was a very good time for that dominant class. But unfortunately, over the last maybe 30 years, you have globalization that's ripped and roared through middle class America, and it continues to do so. That has created a massive problem and has fueled the divide that we're seeing now. So I do want to say that on top of the caste conversation, there needs to be this economic discussion that has to be embedded in it.
That's a wonderful. I think it's just such a man. Where do you even begin, right? I think that's actually something that I wanted us to make sure we talked about. It's like really a call to action for whether us as individual voters, as citizens, as business leaders, whatever role we're playing, physicians. Like, I'd really love this panel to kind of guide some of our audience into the call to action. Like, what do we do to show that economic opportunity? What do we do to highlight the future versus the past? Like, what are the components in your perspectives of making that happen? Jackie, I'd love to start with you if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, if we talk about economic mobility, there have been historic barriers to institutions of higher ed for people of color. And with the recent passing of the great RBG, I have to share, I am worried about what's going to come to the Supreme Court. And particularly, I'm worried about the future of affirmative action, because people of color are still underrepresented in higher ed, even with affirmative action. And with the end of affirmative action, I think we're going to have more racially segregated institutions and more barriers to economic mobility and education.
Well said. Yeah, I can, with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's the future seems a little precarious on the Supreme Court, and it's one of these things that growing up, we always were taught that the Supreme Court was like an apolitical body, right? They were they were the referees to make sure we didn't violate the Constitution, and it is incredible the politicization that the court has taken on. And when we lose a justice, the implications of that are just so heavy right now. It's really incredible. Cynthia, could I turn it over to you next?
Certainly. I think, Jackie, I actually share some reverse of that. I'm actually quite hopeful. I think that what you're going to see is stronger buy-in locally, which truly is what we need. People get very pent up on the national level, but when you think about it day in, day out, national is not what impacts your day. National is not what impacts the districting of your schools and the opportunity that your children will have. It's the local level. And also, your elected representatives. Our bodies, if it were our governing bodies, have gotten away with not having to work together over the past, let's say, 2 decades, because it would get kicked to the Supreme Court. Now we're going to have to work together because that body that was apolitical is now going to be heavily influenced.
Exceptionally well said. And Cynthia, I wanted to also call out, you brought up a really great point that was highly referenced in the book, which is kind of like the memorialization of the victims of the Holocaust. And I wanted to make sure we call that out because that is actually something that I've been researching a little bit with the Equal Justice Initiative, which is Brian Stevenson's organization in Birmingham, Alabama, where he actually memorializes lynchings and he memorializes the slavery and sharecropping trade. It's just it's an absolutely heartbreaking thing to do. I'm very glad that someone has the intestinal fortitude to go on that journey. I'm not sure if I'd be able to be quite honest. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure I call that out as an example of what you were talking about. That's trying to go on here in the United States. Stesha, may I go to you next, if that's all right?
Sure. Well, I just wanted to call out one of the comments. The last one in our comment box on YouTube says, the real question is who and what do we admire based on their character, values, achievements today? From Judy Bello. And I think that really does get at what I think the call to action is for us from this book, right? So like now we have a historical perspective of what's been going on in this country leading up till now. And we have a way of understanding what the hierarchy looks like, why it looks that way. And I think that what we have to do is change what it is that we are focusing on, right? Instead of focusing on just class, which I think is important, like Michael said, we do need to focus on trying to find out how we can come together by getting people to notice that other people's character is what's most important. And if we get people to focus on character, I think a whole lot of opportunities will open up where you're no longer looking at someone's race and thinking only they should only do this job, or thinking someone should only be capable of this particular opportunity, but instead thinking this is someone that I want to learn from. This is someone I want to have be part of my family or my friends. I think that's what's essential. And I think that in the book, Isabel Wilkerson does a really good job of illustrating this. If you guys remember, I want to say it was in part 6 where the plumber comes over to her house and she's talking to the plumber and she starts talking about having recently lost her husband, having recently lost her mother, and he was able to relate to her when they start talking about, their mothers. And I think that opportunity or that instance in the book demonstrated that he was willing to let down his guard when he was able to see her humanity a little bit more. And that is essential. And I don't think that the burden should be on one person having to demonstrate their humanity, but that people should be seeking it out for everyone across the board. But that is essential for us to build empathy and for people to feel like they can relate to each other. And once you feel you can relate to someone, it makes it so much easier for you to look out for their interest in addition to yours.
Excellently said, Stesha. Thank you for that. And, Stesha, I want to call you out particularly because, you've been on this journey with us from 5 days through Caste. You've been present for every session. And for lack of more articulate ways of saying it, you have always brought the heat. Like you bring the best version of yourself every single day. And I think everybody, I can't tell you just how honored I am that you've been a part of this journey with us. And just honestly, so much of my learning has been because of you. So I just wanted to call you out, particularly for being that partner for me.
Thanks, Rajiv. Back at you, buddy.
I want to note, still though, if we don't have diverse communities and schools, how do we create opportunities for the kind of radical empathy that Stesha is describing?
Can I jump in here?
You're going next, my man. Michael, go for it.
The one truth we need to recognize is that the types of conversations that Wilkinson discussed that happened in her basement now happens on social media more and more. Right. And so we actually don't talk to each other face to face anymore. We spend a lot more time on media talking to each other. And so for me, there are two things here. Number one is I know this is going to be polemic and a lot of people are not going to disagree with me on this, but I think it's time for us to start holding these social media companies responsible for what is in their platforms. I mean, before it's like, no, we don't arbitrate content. We don't referee it. But I think the root cause here is that people bear no responsibility for trolling or creating incredible divisive conversations online. That's number one. But then the number two part of this is that I think we need to also practice genuine authenticity, right? Some people can be real people in their real lives, but then when they get online, they take on a new persona just because it gives them a certain level of either credibility, followership, power, or whatever other type of feeling. And a lot of times you look at these two different people and you're like, I cannot believe this person that I know is doing this online. And so if we're going to really get to the root cause of this, we have to bring these big tech companies to the table and say, look, we need to change the discussion in the public square. And the public square has become your platforms. How do you take more responsibility for this American experiment?
You know, Mike, I gotta say, this is a really compelling quote unquote call to action. And it's actually very, because what's interesting is that, everyone on the line has said something to the degree of like, we need to, diversify, we need to be more empathetic. And I think what you're calling out here, and probably similarly as a technologist like myself, we agree that, and what you're identifying is that the infrastructure of communication, particularly, mind you, in a COVID lockdown world, is social media. And if social media if they are the pipes through which our, connections to the outside world are coming in, to what degree is it like a utility, right? To what degree is it something that we got to say, hey, the water coming out of your pipe needs to be the same as the water coming out of somebody else's pipe? You know what I'm saying? And so I think I'd love if you don't mind, I'd love to ask you a follow-up. I mean, can we dive deeper into that? Like if you were, sitting in front of let's say a congressional hearing from the Federal Communications Commission, like, and you were trying to regulate this, like, what does the right answer look like when it comes to making sure that the information we're consuming is fair, balanced, equal across all these platforms? What does right look like?
That's the billion-dollar question.
If you could,
sure, I will.
Cancer and AIDS and all that along
and poverty and death.
Yeah,
Yes,
poverty.
yes,
Just
yes,
fix
yes.
it all for us, if you don't mind.
I don't think there's a clear answer, but I think it boils down to just as these companies, they have metrics for growth, revenue, user engagement, all of this, right? I think that we should also, and I don't think they're going to do this themselves. I think regulation needs to come in here. There should also be a metric for some of the other qualities we want in society, right? I don't know what to call it, but we should be able to track, like, what is the sentiment analysis of the type of language that's happening in that platform? As it crosses a certain threshold that we worry, right? What's the divisiveness of these conversations? We need to now go back and re-engineer those qualities into the algorithms so that those algorithms can not only, one, be able to bring those type of content for consumption, right? To call out when these divisive discussions or issues are happening so that we can take care of them. And so what I'm really getting at is there will be people that have the power to do this are the CEOs of these companies. And unfortunately, the monetary incentive, the economic incentive is not in line for them to do that. So I don't see why they would want to do that. So if we can find a way to connect the ability to earn money with our intention to create a better, a more inclusive, more empathetic, a more united society, then wow, we have the problem solved. But again, we are still so far apart, and that's the challenge. But we can't solve that problem for them. They need to be the ones, because they're the ones that built this thing. They're the ones that are running it. They need to be the ones to come together and say, here are potential solutions, and let's try them out.
Well said, sir. Well said. I want to call out a few folks before we start closing up here. Vascular Tech in the chat said something that I thought was really interesting, was having grown up in North Carolina, it's amazing to see the number of people that will still argue to this day that states' rights, not slavery, was the cause of the Civil War. Anything to sweep it under the rug. I found that to be a fairly helpful and insightful comment. And we had an anonymous comment come in as we were closing out. Something I struggle with is applying the morals of today to the parts of the past. I agree there are absolute truths, but I think that the meaning of many of these symbols has evolved. And I think, to me, the operative word there in that comment is evolved. And our nation is evolving. Our nation looks a lot different today than it did before. I would love to take a minute and just kind of, for me, the call to action, and if I were, I get it, right? I've got so many roots in the South, in the Army. I understand where people are coming from. To me, the big call to action was to take stock of the blessings in my life and really understand to what degree is caste the foundation for those blessings, right? And I think, particularly as let's say a fiscal conservative myself, it's helpful to think of it in terms of free market versus a distorted market, right? When I bought my house, I was kind of competing in a distorted market. Had, sharecropping and redlining not been a factor, 30 to 100 years ago, like the market of housing would have been different, and I might have had to pay more for my house competing in a more fair and equitable market. But I competed in a distorted market. When I go to work, I mean, I am probably competing against a, subjugated caste labor market that I got a step ahead of. And it's not a free and fair market of labor. If it were truly a free and fair market of labor, then maybe I'd be making less, maybe I'd have to work harder. But because of that subjugation, I get to compete in a distorted market. If Babe Ruth didn't have to, he never pitched against Black pitchers, right? Would he still be in the Hall of Fame? These are the kinds of questions that we really need people to ask introspectively. Are you competing in a free and fair market, or are you actually profiting from market distortions? And I think that as a fiscal conservative myself, really was where the aha moment came from. Because once that market distortion comes clear into view, that's where I was able to all right, I get it. There's a problem. I'm about free markets. I'm about free and fair markets, and it's time to fix them. And that was an aha moment for me. So for anyone in the audience, I hope that anecdote might be helpful. Look, folks, I just would love to close out with an excerpt from the book that I think is really powerful. In a world without caste, being male or female, light or dark, immigrant or native born would have no bearing on what anyone was perceived as being capable of. In a world without caste, we would all be invested in the well-being of others and our species, if only for our own survival, and recognize that we are in need of one another more than we have been led to believe. We would join forces with indigenous people around the world, raising the alarm as fires rage and glaciers melt. We would see that when others suffer, the collective human body is set back from the progression of our species. A world without caste would set everyone free. Everyone, this has been just a wonderful journey. Thank you so much for joining us on it. We're going to be back here next week with an interview with Gautam Mukunda, a HKS professor, talking about leadership. And on October 4th, we're going to kick off election season by reading why we're polarized and try and bridge some of these divides. I want to thank everyone for joining on us on this journey. And 99 Pages Club, we're off and running. So thank you all. Michael, Stesha, Jackie, Cynthia. Snaps.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, guys.